You've heard about this thing called Dungeons and Dragons and you don't know what it is. Maybe you've heard of its growing popularity, or maybe a friend or family member of yours plays the game. If role-playing games like D&D are increasingly on your radar, then maybe this video is for you. I'll introduce you to the basic foundations of Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games like it. Hello and welcome to the Dire Pug Storyteller. My name is Jeremiah. When I try and explain things like Critical Role or Vampire LARP to the uninitiated, the simplest question can often be the hardest one to answer. Dungeons and Dragons and similar games like that fall under the umbrella of what we call tabletop role-playing games. But what is a role-playing game? And the answer is multiple people telling a story together at a table or on a server. But that definition is so abstract that it could mean anything from script writing to gossiping. What sets a role-playing game apart is the established narrative expectations and means of arbitrating narrative disputes, which is called a game system or the rules. So a role-playing game is the system by which multiple people engage in storytelling. One or more players take on the role of a protagonist in the story, and another player takes on the responsibilities for anything else the narrative requires. Let's break that down into 3 parts. Player character. Most folk who play role-playing games, which we're going to call RPGs from here on out, will play the game as a player character. The player character is one character controlled by an individual player that contributes to the shared narrative, to serve as one of several of the narrative's protagonists, alongside the other player characters in the RPG. That means, in a usual RPG, that all of the players will be playing player characters to interact with the narrative, except for one player. They will serve as the storyteller, but we'll get to them later. As a player character, you will use the system of the RPG to create a character. The system has a mix of hard rules and soft guidelines to help you create a player character appropriate for the narrative. That's in terms of being compatible with the shared narrative, sufficiently capable of facing the challenges in the narrative ahead, and that's sportingly balanced with the other player characters. If you're playing a game like D&D or Pathfinder, the system will help you create a fantasy hero capable of challenging monsters and magic, all using the power of friendship. If the RPG is more along the lines of Cyberpunk or World of Darkness, you'll be guided into making a more or less contemporary person with superhuman capabilities to fight against an oppressive social and political environment. But the system is just one half of the equation when it comes to creating a player character. You must also consult with the player serving as the storyteller. The storyteller has a lot of responsibilities, and those include being the rules referee and the primary architect for the setting. As a player character, you need to adhere to the rules of the system, and they should not merely fit into the shared narrative that the other players are creating, but they should contribute to it as well. Storytellers, through application of the system, help player characters to do this. All of that accounted for, when you're a player character, you can create any character you want. RPGs will have archetypes and tropes that players will rely upon to help build the narrative. But those are just the foundational launching points. You will be able and encouraged to develop your player character's backstory, their personality, their goals, their appearance, their religious and spiritual beliefs, their network of loved ones, and the complicated relationships that come with that. The list goes on. It truly is endless, and the more that you put into your player character, the more that you could get out of it. I mean, seriously, some folk have been playing the same characters for decades and are still having a blast. The storyteller. If all of the player characters are sharing the limelight in the story, and all individually contribute to the shared narrative in varying degrees, then there is going to be a natural divergence of ideas. Not only that, going beyond simple story disputes, there are a lot of responsibilities, like creating and managing the setting, coming up with all the side characters, and maintaining coherency so all of this makes sense. All of those individual responsibilities add up to the role of the storyteller. In D&D, the storyteller is given the title of the Dungeon Master. In other systems, the storyteller is referred to as the Game Master or Referee or any number of terms. Regardless of the system, the storyteller is responsible for maintaining and running the game. Not only does this mean they are responsible for understanding the chosen RPG system, orchestrating real-world logistics, and managing human relations between players, but they also are responsible for the lioness's share of the narrative. Usually, as a storyteller, you'll pick a system that you want to run. Pitch a concept of what this narrative could look like, and what makes your storytelling style unique, and recruit a group of players who are enticed by that pitch. This is far from a universal standard, as this could vary wildly. Sometimes the players are all complete strangers to each other, while other times most or all of the players are already friends, and other players may be involved in the RPG narrative creating process. Ultimately, the responsibilities of running a role-playing game are many. And as the storyteller, it ultimately falls to you to make sure that these things get done. As a storyteller, you should know most of the material covered in the text of the RPG system. And this includes the numbers and mechanics, but also the story and intentions around them. Knowing the text, simply referred to as the rules. The rules. Or at least having a solid command of them, will allow for three things. A solid foundation on which you can build your narrative, an effective guide for assisting player characters' participation in the narrative, and the ability to swiftly and fairly arbitrate narrative disputes. You construct much of the setting, including the locations, cultures, and individuals within it. But just so you and the other players know what to expect, the system will establish the tropes, cliches, and stereotypes that will help you get started. You further reinforce that by working with your player characters so that they will integrate well into the setting. Further, and this is the important part, the input that you receive from your player characters will help you inspire and inform your setting in turn. In a fun, positive feedback loop, the storyteller and the players build something together that neither party could achieve on their own. And part of that is through swift arbitration by application of the system's rules. A storyteller decides the outcome of a proposed action, usually with the aid of a dice roll. Occasionally, a storyteller will need to explain why they came to the conclusion that they did or why they're interpreting the text as they do. But a well-functioning RPG group has good communication and is built on a foundation of trust. The system. The system, or the type of RPG game you'll be playing, will wildly change the type of narratives available to you and the other players. Some systems have heroic fantasy adventure narratives, whereas others have depressing and dark horror stories. Regardless, the players will usually play characters that are small fish in a big pond. They'll have to band together and overcome their own differences in order to face the challenges ahead. Many systems use many different kinds of dice to resolve their narrative disputes, but not all systems are like that. Two really great examples are Dread and 10 Candles, which use Jenga-like blocks and, well, candles, respectively. But using D&D as the mainstream example, the system tells you that the game is a heroic fantasy in a somewhat Dark Ages to Enlightenment era, and will provide the player characters with rules to make appropriately heroic protagonists. As the system's narrative revolves around small groups of heroes fighting small groups of monsters and outlaws, many rules will be provided to cover the high-stakes drama that we call combat. The system also informs you that reality-bending magic is around, so there will be many rules for that too. But perhaps the less obvious and far less celebrated aspect of the system are the rules that aren't there. When it comes to the more social elements or character backstory building elements of game, players are usually left to their own devices. Player characters, and to a lesser extent, the characters created by the storyteller, are expected to be somewhat realized personalities of fiction, with a family and childhood experiences, worldviews, spiritual practices, and goals of various magnitudes. And yet, despite it also being an important part of the game, we don't have the extensive rules that there are for combat or magic. And that's a good thing. While the system helps the players realize their characters within the system, it heavily falls upon the players themselves to breathe life into the narrative, and to truly make it something personal and unique. Taken at face value, the D&D system is a somewhat efficient game, revolved around small squads of magical soldiers fighting other small squads of magical soldiers, slowly growing in capability. But the storytelling elements around it, and the creative chaos that the game evokes, that's what makes the game really special. Outro. Again, this isn't the sort of hobby that your average American engages in on a regular basis. While we live in a fantastic time of literally endless storytelling in movies, TV shows, video games, books, we often don't see the behind the scenes of how those things are made. And when we do, even rarer is the opportunity to see how the writing or creative process goes. By taking your time to describe these scenes, deepen your character, highlight the action and drama, role-playing games seek to emulate, even surpass some of the best aspects of contemporary media. It's like watching a movie, except you get to make the decisions for the protagonist and see the consequences play out. It's got the best parts of the serial show, where you get to spend hours developing these characters. It's also like a video game with a big, expansive world to explore, except no frustrating invisible walls or stilted dialogue options. Ending on a sentimental note here. Before all of this, all of the movies, the cameras, the computers, when there was nothing between us and the stars, the origins of us as a people, across all boundary lines, begins with the shared experience around a fire telling stories. And storytelling like that never dies.